Hey, TechKnowStuds. In this lesson, we're going to approach this topic of, do we choose Microsoft? Do we go down the Linux route? Do we choose Apple products? And it can be really a contentious subject. That is, there are some people that are just really adamant about the brands that they chose and they use. And they are really unwilling to entertain anything else. And I have my own preferences as well. And so there's certainly going to be an element of that I'm going to introduce in this, my opinion over these three, but I'm going to try to be somewhat unbiased with this and just give you my 25 years of experience of being in this industry and even longer being a computer geek, what my impression is of these three and where I would use it. The first thing that I want to address is that I'm going to be mainly comparing operating systems. And we can see that Linux is an operating system, but Microsoft and Apple are both companies. But we can't really just rule out just the operating system and compare that because there is some other considerations. So we're going to take a look at that from a holistic viewpoint of what is these brands look like and what's associated with these brands, what's associated with Microsoft, what's associated with Apple, and what's associated with Linux. Another thing that I will mention, that there are certain people that get really passionate about comparing these. That there are people who are just really for Microsoft, or really diehard Apple people, or really just love Linux. Or you find people who are really anti one of these, like maybe they're against Microsoft, or they really don't like Apple products, or perhaps they just feel really frustrated with Linux, or so they might be really anti one or a couple of these. I will also tell you that I have a lot of experience with all three of these, and I love all three of them, but for different reasons and different purposes. So I'll get into that as well. To really understand the strengths and the weaknesses of all three of these, we really have to understand what it is that they are delivering to us, what products there are. And so what we're going to classify this is there's a hardware aspect to this, there's an operating system that goes on that hardware, and then there's apps that get put on top of that. And so one thing we have to understand is that Apple is really a hardware company. They are there selling you phones and laptops and iPads. That's what they are. They want to sell products to you, hardware to you, and that they create an operating system to work with that hardware. And so that is their primary goal, is sell that hardware. Versus Microsoft, they actually started out as an app company, but they created an OS to help deliver their apps, to make it easier to use their apps. Later on, they figured out how much money they could actually make with selling an operating system and becoming like dominating essentially that market. And so they started creating operating systems. Although they do sell some hardware, it's not really necessarily linked directly to the hardware that they're selling. Linux came about because they wanted an open source, free software out there that you could run on your computer. So it really always was meant to be, and still is, just an operating system. To really fully understand the different products that we have to understand a little bit about the architecture and how they architect things. There's something called closed architecture and there's something called open architecture. And we're not going to get really in depth into the details of that, but open just means that things are a little more freely available. People can go in and do some editing and be able to help contribute to it. And there's a lot more freedom with it. Versus closed architecture is just a lot more tight in how things are operated. And so we're going to kind of address that, but we're not going to get into that specifically. So let's start out with Apple. Apple is typically a very closed architecture. And when you go out and buy a MacBook Pro, which is a laptop, you're buying it with Mac OS on it. So these two are tightly intertwined and they're linked together. That is, you don't really take the Mac OS and go and install it on some other device, some other company's device. And you don't typically take like a Microsoft operating system and install it on a MacBook Pro. I've seen it done before, but it's not something that typically happens. So you really have this tight bond between the hardware and the operating system. And even the apps that are developed, anybody can develop an app for Mac products. However, the restrictions on what they can develop and how they develop it and how it operates is all there. It's all very detailed. And so there's this loose link between the apps and the Apple products where you have to really comply with how Apple wants you to create those apps. Now let's take the opposite side of the spectrum and let's take a Linux machine. A Linux, which is once again just the operating system, is a free open community that really shares a lot of stuff and helps develop things together. And so because of that, it really has a lot of flexibility. It's a very open architecture and you can install it on a lot of different devices, a lot of hardware, a lot of machines that are out there. Anybody can develop apps for it. And so there's really the kind of this loose linking between this operating system and anything that you use it on. Then you have Microsoft, which is somewhere in between. They have a loose connection with the hardware that they get installed on. That is, it's very typical that you see Microsoft operating systems installed on a lot of different people's laptops and desktops, but it's not as common to see it installed on other type of devices. And so we see here kind of a loose connection with the hardware. And then the apps, there's lots of different apps that are available to it. And there's a lot of freedom in how developers develop their apps for the Microsoft operating system. Because of their different approaches, it really creates a very, very different feel to these different products that they have. So for instance, Apple is very tightly controlled, and because of that, there's a sense of just ease of use and stability with their products. Versus Linux has this really free, open community that really has a lot of adaptability. And then Microsoft is somewhere in between those two. So where would we use each one of these products? Well, I find that Apple is great for home users. It's really easy to use and it really has a lot of interoperability between their different products. And so it's great for home users. We also see that it's really popular amongst creative professionals, people who are doing like graphic design or video editing or in any of those more kind of creative artistic areas. And one of the reasons for that is because they had graphics and user interfaces that were really awesome and way before its time compared to like Microsoft systems. It took Microsoft a long time to catch up. Now, I would say at this point in time, Microsoft has caught up and they're just as good as Apple from this creative professional, but since Apple really had the market to begin with, creative professionals still like to use Apples. And then there are a lot of programmers that do like to use Apple over the Microsoft products or the Linux products. Microsoft targeted businesses. And so what they did is they created operating systems that worked really well with each other, that they networked well with each other, that they were able to share out resources together. I mean, Apple had an element of that, but they decided to go down their own proprietary way, which really didn't pan out for them. And whereas Microsoft created these great systems where you could really manage the Microsoft products really well. And so IT support generally likes Microsoft better. That's not always the case, but IT support really likes Microsoft, generally speaking, because they're much easier to manage from a business perspective or organizational wide. But because we use it when we go into our businesses, since we use them when we're at work, then a lot of times that's a great option for home users because they can actually, take the same skills that they use at work and take them home and use them on their home computing devices as well. Then we have Linux. Linux can be very cool because it's open and we can really play around with it. There's lots of things that we can change and manipulate and really make it work for us. Because of that, it can go on a lot of different type of devices. So we see that more on mobile devices. It's free and open, so companies can take that and use it for their devices and really get the environment exactly the way they want it for their end users. So it can be put on a lot of custom hardware, but it can be a little more difficult to use because there's so much variable, so many things that you can really control. And so this tends to be more geared for techies, at least from an operating standpoint, using it on a laptop or a desktop. That's where techies somebody who's a lot more technical would use a Linux machine. I'm going to sum up these three products into some simple terms and tell you how I use these products, because I use all three of them. If I were to sum up my Apple products into just 3 words, I would sum it up as It just works. Is that always the case? No, it's not. That is, I've had issues with my Apple products, but generally speaking, I find them really solid and easy to use. It's one of the reasons why I switched quite a while ago from Android phones to Apple products and my Apple phone. And it's one of the reasons why, even though I'm not a huge Apple person, I end up finding myself with an Apple Watch, I have an iPad, I have a iPhone, I have AirPods, I have a MacBook Pro here sitting in the back. I guess it's on this side. I've got these products because I find that they work well together. I have had issues with some of the connectivity, some of the interoperability between these devices, but mostly speaking, they work well together, and I've had a lot of good experiences with this over some of the other products that I've used. If I were to sum up Microsoft's operating systems into 3 words, I would say easier to support. They really have built their stuff for businesses so that way people can manage. We can manage it from an organizational wide. We have things like Active Directory and a lot of different services to help manage those machines, making sure that they're safe and secure and be able to help the whole organizational wide. And so they're much easier to support, which is one reason why I actually in the 90s switched from using Apple on a regular basis to using Microsoft. And today, even my desktops and my laptops, most of them are all Microsoft based because I just find that it's the easiest for me to use. I love Linux. I'm going to vote this as being most adaptable. Because we can put it on all of our IoT devices, it's on my Synology drive, it's on my TVs, it's on a lot of the devices that I have, and it works great for those applications because it can be installed on all those devices and utilized on all those devices. I really don't like it from a desktop or laptop perspective. I find it very difficult to support and do certain things on those devices. I have to do a lot of research to figure out how to do certain things on those Linux machines. Now, I do use it from a server perspective. It works great from a server perspective. So that's where I would use Linux, is either the server or on those IoT devices or on the things that are really set up with a different interface to make it easy to use. So I love all 3 of these. They all have a time and a place in my life and how I utilize them. And I always find it a little funny when people get really passionate about one or the other and they start hating one of the other devices. And it's like, well, they do have their time and place and an area where they shine. You're gonna have to make the best decision for you on which products are going to be best for you.